Hello and welcome to the first episode of 2026 of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. I'm going to give a little bit of a content warning for this episode. Not that it will be especially violent compared to anything else, but while we are not the most cheerful podcast, we are certainly not easy listening. We're not put it in and go for a run type podcast. This one, I feel anyway, will be especially bleak. And so if you would like to put that on hold for a better time, I will forgive you for that. And since dropping a plug at any other point in this episode will feel exploitative, I'll just put it right before I say anything. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters starting at $2 a month. If you would please drop some of your questions. I put up a post on Patreon for any paying members. We're going to do a question and answer episode. Next episode will be the 2025 year in review. Then we'll probably have to do a news update podcast just because otherwise it'll be too long in between news. And then following that, there will be the question and answer episode. We already have a bunch of questions from Patreon, from our Discord, and I've also looked through some of the message I received on Patreon to try to answer some of the questions that I got throughout this year there as well. So once again, patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. And before I get into the meat of the episode, I do have to report on the conditions in Ukraine in general and Kyiv specifically. What is unfolding right now is a humanitarian catastrophe. Russia, in a coordinated missile and drone attack, was able to take out much of the electricity, heating, and even water infrastructure for the city of Kyiv. For the last over a week, there has been extremely minimal access to electricity. For the first 2 days or so, I did not have any heat at all, and we are going through unusually cold winter. There is currently a rather unusual weather pattern happening over Eastern Europe in general right now, and temperatures in Ukraine within the next 2 weeks in some places will hit negative 20 degrees Celsius, which is below 0 Fahrenheit. Under normal conditions, when infrastructure is working correctly, this is the kind of situation that does lead to death. Now, without electricity, without heat, it's looking to be a disaster. People will die. Elderly people, infirm especially, will die. Now, I have some advantages here. The building that I live in is fairly modern. It's from the 2000s. It has pretty good insulation. What I have done is closed up the doors to my kitchen and bedroom and have been able to keep my living room a bit warmer. So I relocated to living room, which is interesting because I think at, the old Ukrainian huts, it's usually a fairly large structure, then it has a smaller living space that's easier to keep heated. And I'm like, well, more things change, I suppose. However, a lot of people do not have these benefits. When you're thinking of older buildings, there is not as good of insulation, which means they're harder to keep warm. A lot of the problems are very dependent on where you are in the city. I'm on the half of the city, the eastern half, which is facing more difficulties than the western half. But my neighborhood is better off than most over here. There are some who have gone 24 more hours without heat or electricity. Frost is forming on the inside of these buildings, and people are having to get creative of how to stay warm. And in fact, the mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, even advised that people leave Kyiv, if possible, if they have somewhere else to go, as there is not an end to these problems in sight. And also, frankly, having less people in the city could lead to less stress on the system. So there's a state of emergency, and people are advised to leave. It's also not just Kyiv. Even before these difficulties were faced by Kyiv, the city of Dnipro, as well as Zaporizhzhia, have gone a little bit longer in the dark, and really all regions of the country are experiencing it on some level or another. The response to this has been opening up warming areas, points of invulnerability, they are called. Some are operated by the government, by the city government in particular. Some are private initiatives, including the famous yurt of invincibility provided by a businessman from Kazakhstan, a Kazakh yurt, a big nomadic tent. It's I have the t-shirt. It's cool. The Jewish community is providing these as well, and really everyone is doing their part. The purpose of these attacks are, as always, to break Ukrainian morale, to plunge Ukrainians into darkness, into cold, and saying that if Ukraine surrenders, then Russia will allow people to live. Of course, nobody buys this. The occupied territories are a complete mess, so no one expects to have good infrastructure under occupation anyway. But as always, all this does is strengthen resolve. As for me personally, I already gave my spiel on how I have it better than others, but not gonna lie, this has been hard. It's cold. Cold has the ability to kind of sap things from you, though it has been getting better day by day, I will say. So while I don't have anything in particular prepared to suggest to you, the usual humanitarian outlets in Ukraine right now could use the extra help. Different military units are collecting jackets, socks, that kind of thing. It's a rough winter, and we're looking at minimum the next 2 weeks of very extreme weather. Not everyone's going to come out of this alive, but you have to keep moving forward. And on top of all of that, in a situation that's actually not as drastic as it's made out to be in the international media, a part of this attack on Ukrainian infrastructure was done using an Oreshnik missile. The Oreshnik is an intermediate-range ballistic missile that is designed to carry nuclear warheads, although in this case it was not. I did a video for this for New Voice of Ukraine. You can go to english.nv.ua or patreon.com/nvua for my work over there, but the Oreshnik missile is supposed to be a nuclear missile, which means that it gets all the attention of a nuclear missile. And what happens when you launch a nuclear missile is that if nothing else is known about it, that means that all the other nuclear powers in the world are seeing your nukes leave their silos, and they have only a few minutes to launch their nukes from their silos, leading to the end of the world. So naturally, in order to avoid that situation, Russia had to inform the United States and probably the UK and France that it was launching this Oreshnik missile, and to tell them that it was not nuclear armed, telling them where it would hit and that it would not hit one of them, meaning that this was downgraded from a nuclear threat to really just another conventional missile strike on Ukraine by Russia, which is kind of grim in that essentially those countries had to say, yes, we understand this attack is going to take place and we will not do anything about it. And while in the larger sense, you do have to recognize that nuclear threats are of a different category than anything else, that they knew the attack was coming and did nothing about it is still dark. But ultimately, because it was just a conventional missile strike, it did not cause especially large damage when it hit Lviv, as much damage as you could expect from any other missile strike. And so the extreme expense of the Oreshnik, the scare factor of it, was just meant to freak people out, and ultimately it was just another missile. And that's grim to say. Any missile strike is bad, but it is normal. Horrifying thought for it to be normal, but it was normal. It was not Russia starting nuclear war. It's just them lashing out for some propaganda win by scaring people. So that's the latest update involving these strikes as well as their result. But the episode that I was preparing when all this was happening and suffered an extreme strike to my productivity, we can say, was about Ukraine losing a town, was about the people of that town losing their homes. And as you can tell from the title of this episode, I'm talking about Huliaipole. I've talked about Huliaipole quite a lot when it has come up. In our last news episode, I was describing how the situation on that front had starkly deteriorated and that the Russians were on the verge of overrunning the town. And at this point, the entirety of Huliaipole is at minimum gray zone, with large swaths of it being taken directly by the Russians. Well, I wanted to tell the story of this place. If you follow the war, as many do, through maps. Even as this podcast goes, I describe military updates. I'm very dry, most of the time anyway, and to the fact of just what is happening. Russia is advancing in this location. Ukrainians are counterattacking in that location. Here are where the threats of encirclement are, etc., etc. But these are places people live. A part of the map that was white yesterday and red today represents people who lost everything, losing their homes, losing, in many cases, their families, losing the places where their memories happened, losing their heritage. It means not just where you lived, but leaving behind the graves of your loved ones, never to see them again, abandoning them possibly forever. I saw one story of a Ukrainian woman talking about how she couldn't leave her town on the front because that is where her son was buried. It means the destruction of your memories, or at best relegating them to simply memories, with no way to directly connect with them ever again. When the red on the map moves forward, it brings tragedy, it brings despair, it brings destruction. It means a family who thought that they were just going to live in their house, in their town, for the rest of their lives before eventually passing peacefully as all people wish to do, and instead being torn apart by war, of the patch of farmland that you have tended to your whole life being turned into a no man's land, scarred by artillery shells and crisscrossed by the wires connecting drones to their command. It means the school that you went to as a kid, made your first friends, turned into a pile of rubble, while those friends have either fled far away were buried in their front yards. And for that, I'd like to tell this story about Huliaipole, about the city that's happening to right at this very moment, though there are many like it, and there will be more and more until this war reaches its conclusion. Huliaipole is a small city in the Zaporizhzhia region, a little bit less than an hour and a half to 2 hours away from Zaporizhzhia by car. This region of the country, for centuries, was the home of the Cossacks. If you listen to my history episode, which was the first episode from last year, I don't know if this is a tradition to talk about history on the first episode of a year, this area was in between empires. It was a frontier, out of reach of the authorities in Warsaw, Moscow, and Istanbul. It was the site of frequent warfare, raids. In this environment was the Cossacks, a group of semi-autonomous warrior groups who were able to live with a degree of freedom, the freedom that comes from self-sufficiency anyway, which is a difficult type of freedom. And the trade-off for that was that they were frequently at war, patrolling this frontier between Poland and Turkey and protecting the lands further inland. So that is the general vibe that this region had, that continued throughout history, really into today. If you listen to a lot of the people who come from there, this Cossack spirit, the romanticism of Cossack virtues, and really the willingness of Cossacks to put up a fight is definitely something that continues onward into Ukrainian identity today. And as Russia took over this area, as it liquidated the Zaporizhzhian Siege and put an end to Cossack liberties, very soon after that, the liquidation of the Siege happened in 1775. In 1785, the Russian Empire was establishing new defensive lines against the Ottoman Turks. This was called the Dnipro Defensive Line. There were a series of fortifications and manned military outposts in between the Russian Empire and Crimea, which was held by the Turks. And Huliaipole was a part of that. It was a town settled by many of the descendants of Cossacks to form a military frontier against Turkey. Meanwhile, it was also a early hub of a trade route. It was a Chumak road is what they were called. These traders who went from the Azov Sea selling salt, honey, whatever it may be, further inland. It was a commercial highway that Huliaipole was on, and so from very early on, it was associated with trade festivals, being a support network for the commerce, and very early types of industrialization, weavers and that kind of thing that would benefit from being on a trade route. And so as you get into the 19th century and its importance as a defensive point long gone, it did become an early hub in the area for early industry, for the support networks that happen around agriculture. It had a lot of mills and granaries. You would farmers from elsewhere could take their products to Huliaipole to get it processed from grain into flour. And as industrialization carried onward, there were factories building a lot of farm equipment, tractors, combines. So it was this weird mix of urbanization and industrialization, but in a very agricultural area. Industry to service the agriculture. This is something that if you spent a lot of time in rural areas, you can figure out pretty well. If you go through very heavily rural areas, the town that you go through will probably be heavy on the mechanics and that kind of thing for people to come and get things fixed up. That was what Huliaipole was. And in order to develop this, the Russians invited settlers from outside of Ukraine, primarily but not exclusively, German Mennonites. Another thing I talked a bit about the history episode is that the Germans were seen as a very industrious people, very capitalist people, and modern, and so they were seen as the ideal way to boost the early industrial economy. And Huliaipole was one place that became very much associated with these German Mennonites, and many of the historical locations in Huliaipole are associated with its Mennonite history. But the very end of the 19th century, within this early peasant industrialism, was born probably the most famous person out of Huliaipole, and that is Nestor Ivanovich Makhno. Nestor Makhno would eventually become one of the most famous anarchist leaders in history, leading the Revolutionary Black Army during the period of the Civil War following World War I. If you have any familiarity with anarchism, socialism, or really the Eastern European punk music scene, you've probably heard his name before. This city was his home. And so in 1888, he was born into a peasant family, and his father, as is the case in many of these tales, died when he was very young. And as a peasant with a dead father, that meant he had to become a worker very early in his age. He was poor, had to work a lot. He did many things, worked on farms, factories, in order to provide for his family, until eventually joining a group known as the Union of Poor Peasants during the 1905 revolution. Now, what was happening in the Russian Empire in 1905 was that they had just lost the Russo-Japanese War and were in chaos. The massive blow to the prestige of the empire, the money dumped into the war, and let's face it, a large racial component of this. This was the first time in a long time that a white empire, the Russians, lost to non-white people in a major conflict, not just some colonial border skirmish where maybe a dozen British soldiers were wiped out or something, but a full, proper, mechanized war between two countries, one of them white and one of them not white. And the Russians were very convinced that being the white people in that meant they were going to win, and they didn't win. So yeah, there is a very heavy racial component to this as well that led to a severe loss in the standing of imperial power. And that led to the 1905 revolution, where it was primarily liberal in standing. They wanted to do a constitutional monarchy, and though that was the goal, many of the people who would become later famous in the 1917 revolution got their start in 1905. One of them being Makhno. But whilst many of the more famous figures of that movement were involved in the cities, socialism, liberalism, these were urban ideas more so than rural ones, and efforts to bring them into rural areas were often very frustrated. This Union of Poor Peasants, in the aftermath of this revolution, which was brutally crushed and had all of its gains reversed because Russia doesn't like keeping anything good, this group, the Union of Poor Peasants, carried out expropriations, which was the term they used for stealing from rich people, until eventually getting into a gunfight with the cops that really brought the heat on them. But after his Union of Poor Peasants were mostly caught, after they had assassinated a police informant, many of them were executed, while Makhno was given a reprieve, but later arrested again, was shuffled around between different prisons between what's now the city of Dnipro, Luhansk, and eventually to Moscow. And it was during this time period, in his years in prison, where he gained much more of an anarchist education, because it was in these years after the 1905 revolution when a lot of the anarchists, socialists, communists, liberals, nationalists, a lot of them were in prison at this time, and while they were in prison, exchanged ideas with each other. And he gained a much more dedicated devotion to the ideas of anarchism, especially as developed by the Russian anarchist theorist Peter Kropotkin. His book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, was the most important single factor in the development of Makhno's political ideology. But then came 1917. This is now 7 years in prison, and I may have left this out. He started this when he was 17 years old. He was an anarchist insurrectionist when he was 17 years old, went to jail 1910, gets out 1917, because this was this next revolution, the February Revolution. The Tsar is overthrown. The government of the Russian Empire is replaced by a kind of soft social democratic, it's called provisional government, while different parts of the empire, such as Ukraine, seek greater autonomy. Ukraine under the Central Rada of Reshevsky. But this revolution happens, they release political prisoners, and among them Nestor Makhno. And at the beginning, very early on, he is in Moscow, but within short order returns to Huliaipole, where he begins to organize political factions in the city, based around his former anarchist comrades. This was a very politically complicated time, and quite frankly, the Civil War period is so complicated that I will not even begin to try to describe a step-by-step breakdown of what would happen over the next few years and just give a broad overview. So initially, he returns to Huliaipole in 1917, and through force of personality and organizing, is able to gain a position of leadership in the community, and he and his anarchists begin to organize the city along pseudo-anarchist lines. They begin to do land distributions, so taking land from rich people, giving it to poor people and communes of poor people. The police, who they had been at violent war with for many years, were disarmed, while the ones that were seen as being less troublesome were allowed to continue in a law enforcement position, but disarmed and unable to attack the workers as they had done previously. He organizes workers, he organizes renters, does a bunch of socialist stuff. But they begin to see the beginning of where things can go wrong. There is an attempted right-wing coup against the provisional government, and keep in mind, this is all happening during World War I. They're all still very much involved in World War I at this time. So following a attempted right-wing coup against the Russian in provisional government, they begin to take things more seriously. They see the writing on the wall that there would be a conservative reaction to the experiments in socialism that were currently ongoing, and were much more proactive against the local capitalists and the establishment of communes. But then comes the October Revolution at the end of 1917, and initially, Makhno sees this as a positive. He was not the same type of socialist as the Bolsheviks who carried out the October Revolution, but saw it as a broad left-wing cause, something that would eventually come back to bite him in the ass, as history has often shown would be the case. And at first, Makhno did take the side of the Ukrainian National Republic at the time, the kind of predecessor to the modern state of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian state at that time did have some social democratic leanings, but ultimately nowhere as revolutionary as those of Makhno and his anarchists in Huliaipole. So when Kiev gave the instructions to return some of the lands to their former capitalist owners and landlords, Makhno resisted, and this turned into conflict with the Ukrainian National Republic. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks would eventually come to negotiate Russia's surrender to Germany and Austria in what's called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And as a part of that, Ukraine was granted independence from Russia, but became a client state of Germany and Austria, primarily Germany. There was some haggling between who would be more dominant in that, but that's a tale for another day, especially considering that the Austrian faction was represented by a rather flamboyant personality who really took to being Ukrainian in a way, but it was the Germans who got that, and the pro-German government of Kiev was headed up by Pavlo Skoropadsky, a conservative monarchist who wanted to make it wanted Ukraine to become a constitutional monarchy. And most importantly for Huliaipole and Makhno and his followers was that Germany would extract grain from Ukraine. Again, looking back to the history episode, grain is the most important thing in much of Ukrainian history, and as Germany was facing severe famines, it was very brutal for the German civilian population as World War I was reaching its end. Severe lack of food. Many people died, but the occupation of Ukraine under this client government of Skoropadsky was seen as a way to alleviate that, though ultimately not in full, which meant that the anarchists of Huliaipole had their first enemy, which was the German and Austrian soldiers who were there to take their grain from them. And this is really where the really complicated stuff begins. But essentially, during this time period of the German occupation, which lasted until 1918, without German support, Skoropadsky was very quickly overthrown by the government of Petlura in a coup. So they fought against the Germans and the Austrians, and then in this civil war, you had the Ukrainian National Forces under Petlura now. You had the Red Army, the Bolsheviks in Ukraine, was based out of Kharkiv. You had the White Army, which was the remnants of the former imperial forces. Some of them monarchists, not all of them. It was a big mix of forces, but it was headed up by very conservative reactionary generals and officers. You had the Green Army, which was basically warlords without particular ideological concern and would themselves switch sides, though often, but certainly not. And you had the Black Army under Makhno. Huliaipole during this time was taken and lost over and over and over again. Each time another force would take it from Makhno and his anarchists, there would usually be a purge of some kind where people were murdered, as was the case during the German-Austrian occupation. Many of the socialist organizers in the city were killed, including members of Makhno's family, his friends. But really the worst of it was under the Whites. Now, you may certainly be predisposed to see the Reds as the worst of the factions in the Civil War, considering what they would eventually do. But I've always had a special hate for the White Army. It was viciously anti-Ukrainian and viciously anti-Semitic. Many of the leadership of the White movement saw their fall from power as being part of a clandestine Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, and they were merely the first victims of that. And indeed, when they would eventually lose, they would spread this ideology throughout Europe, eventually leading to the ears of the Nazis and other anti-Semitic groups that would eventually ally themselves with the Nazis in interwar Europe. And really, the Whites had a very proto-fascistic outlook on the world that I think if they had won would simply have meant that the alternate universe history, we could see it as a White Army ruled Russia being a different version of the Nazis. They were bad. And indeed, when they occupied Huliaipole, they did a lot of violence. They did many purges. They killed a lot of Jews. They killed a lot of course, the anarchists as well. And after the Germans and Austrians had left the war, really the Whites were Huliaipole's main foe. While Makhno, during this occupation of his city, took his forces to become basically guerrilla fighters, having been displaced from the towns and villages that they were from. They became almost semi-nomadic in a way. The way they fought was much more mobile than any other forces in this war. Basically what they did, one thing they became very famous for, if you're not an anarchist but a more military technology type of guy, the thing that you would have known them for at this time period was the development of the Tachanka. The Tachanka, you would take a horse carriage and you would put a machine gun on it, because a machine gun at this time was a very effective weapon. Many casualties from World War I came from machine guns. If you think of the classic Battle of the Somme or something like that, a movie about this, it involves a big line of people charging against no man's land as they're ripped apart by machine gun fire and artillery. But these machine guns didn't move very well. They were big. They required multiple people to operate, and reestablishing a new machine gun nest took time, and once you built it there, it's just there. It's a fixed position. So what the Tachanka did was take that fixed position and put it on a cart so it can run around, like old horse cavalry or something like that. Nowadays, we'd call something like this a technical. A lot of the wars, and especially Africa, were fought by taking a Toyota truck, putting a machine gun on the back to be highly mobile. And we have seen this in Ukraine quite a lot as well. a lot of the air defense of Kiev is carried out by technicals, a truck with a machine gun in the back. And that's the same basic idea of what the Tachanka was, though at the time it was horse-drawn rather than motorized. And this war, fought from Tachanka, carried on for some time until the most important battle of the war that they fought, at the Battle of Perehonovka. Because Huliaipole's forces were able to stay mobile, they were able to draw the White Army further and further away from its supplies, overstretched them until they were near the city of Uman. I've talked about Uman a million times, directly south of Kiev, by about 3 hours or so. So they draw these White Army forces to about Uman, overstretched, losing their lines, till Makhno doubles back on them, fights the Battle of Perehonovka, defeats them, including in close combat. He was very much at the front of all this. So the White Army was very heavily destroyed at this point. Reports from after this battle, just corpses everywhere. And in the days after this, with the White Army in the area, there's more White Army. The White Army is fighting all over the place, from Ukraine to the Pacific Ocean. There's factions of the White Army fighting, so this isn't the whole of the White Army, but this particular group destroyed, allowing the anarchists to retake the city of Zaporizhzhia, the city of Dnipro, and the city of Huliaipole, which is probably the largest extent of the territory that they controlled. So from Huliaipole, it was the headquarters of this movement, but keep in mind, it was still anarchist. So that's a bit of a question. How do you have an anarchist government? What happens when anarchists are in charge of something? That's always been the big question. This idea of a decentralized, non-hierarchical polity, we can call it, based on the ideas of anarchism. How do you keep something like that together, especially during wartime, when an army, something that modern-day anarchists in Ukraine figured out very quickly in the war, an army requires centralized command and control, centralized control of logistics, that kind of thing. It's a hard needle to thread. And what they came up with was platformism, this version of anarchism that allowed for more government in a way. But it was still very based around local councils, very decentralized, localized, communalized. And because of that, any one local commune had a great deal of internal autonomy, at least in theory. And the amount of this territory changed very rapidly. I'm using this point after the Battle of Perehonovka as the maximum extent where it went from most of the modern Zaporizhzhia Oblast into Dnipro, into parts of Donbass and along the Azov Sea, but again, headquartered Huliaipole. So this little town had quite a historical impact. But this was done in alliance with the Bolshevik Red Army. And the Bolsheviks did not like the idea of anyone else controlling their own destiny. And with now the White Army out of the way, and the battles with the White Army would continue, but this was really the death blow for the White Army in Ukraine. Afterwards, there were some other offensives, but in another one of these alternate universe scenarios, had the White Army won this battle, there was nothing in between them and Moscow, and different White Army forces would have been able to converge on Moscow and potentially win the Civil War. This battle prevented that. And I know a lot of my listeners out there are hearing this could have ended the Civil War in a White Army victory instead of a Red Army victory and think, great, at least the Soviet Union would have won. I really have to emphasize that the Whites were not better. The ideology of Russia right now is very heavily based off of white philosophers that would go on, as I said, to influence Nazi ideology, that spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that were extreme opponents to Ukrainian independence on any level. Many of the worst impulses that we see from Russia right now were inherited from the whites. And that is, again, another one of these very scary alternative histories that very easily could have gone worse than the one we got. So the idea of Makhno cutting them off from taking Moscow, I still consider a positive, because these guys were very, very scary people. anyway. So this battle that had cut them off from their other forces prevented them from doing it. But now their main opponent became the Reds, new enemies every couple months. And this relationship with the Reds was very complicated. They would go back and forth. There would be times where they would be allied with each other briefly, but then quickly turn to conflict shortly thereafter. If the Red Army took over an area, they would violently purge anarchists, just shoot them, just summarily execute anarchists when they would enter a new town. And in response, the anarchists would often do the same to the communists, going back and forth for a while, though at one point they did join up together for an offensive on Crimea, because Crimea was where the whites were headquartered. It was their main base, at least in Ukraine. But after the whites are taken care of, now the Reds are able to focus on the blacks. Everyone has a color here. It makes it easy. And the Reds give this command to Makhno to take part in the invasion of Poland, which Makhno refuses, bringing the conflict to a head until eventually the Bolsheviks order the complete liquidation of the black forces in 1921. Makhno escapes from Huliaipole and Ukraine with his entourage after a very long, winding trip that took a lot of different directions, being harassed and followed throughout the way, are eventually able to escape into Romania and then eventually settling in Paris. And Huliaipole becoming a part of Bolshevik Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And that's the story. Very, very truncated, mind you. I feel like I said a lot, but that is the most surface level way I could have possibly described that. And I feel unhappy with the amount of detail I left out. But after this, Pole is very associated with one of the communists' main enemies. It was the center point of this anarchist territory, the Free Territory. And so a lot of the people still living there, even after the Black Army was in exile in Paris, were associated in one way or another with this enemy. And the Red Terror came down very hard. Makhno's family and relations were treated with extreme suspicion from there on out. And throughout the history of the Soviet Union, after Stalin was long gone even, and things were more opened up, the Soviet authorities always kept an eye on Huliaipole for any resurgence of anti-Soviet anarchist activity. And so the story of Huliaipole became much more familiar to the history of any other Ukrainian town. They faced the ravages of the Holodomor. This was a farming community in Ukraine that relied on the grain harvest, very rural, met all the factors that marked the most hard-hit areas of the Holodomor. Holodomor being the starvation famine of primarily 1933, in which 3 to 5 million people died, starved to death, in engineered famine, which the Soviet authorities encouraged. Then comes World War II. Jews of the town were slaughtered. But throughout all these tragedies, the city still stood. And after World War II ended, where there was another surge of industrialization, urbanization, the factories that were already existing were built up, more housing was built. And though it was never a large city by any stretch, it was a regional hub, as it had always been, and was at least larger than many of the surrounding villages. Very rural area, as I've described in some of the past combat episodes, is one of the confounding factors in all this, is that as the Russians are advancing, they're advancing through rural territory with not many strong points to defend, and Huliaipole being one of those strong points. And into the independence era, now with freedom to express themselves, the city once again becomes famous for its attachment to this anarchist movement, and it got a lot of tourism because of it, for such as myself. And it is in the year 2020 where the story of Huliaipole begins to intersect with my own. It was late December of 2020. I was in Zaporizhzhia for the holidays, and I decided to take a day trip out there. It's relevant to my own political interests, certainly, and I wanted to go see it, make a little pilgrimage to Makhno's town. So I go there, and I am extremely impressed. In the past, I talked about this in terms of tourist infrastructure, actually, where if you go to a lot of places in Ukraine, the tourist infrastructure is not great. You can go to a city or a town that is historically significant for one thing or another, but really having to figure things out on your own, which is not always an easy thing for a tourist to do, unless they would do a lot of background research beforehand. And as someone who thinks about this kind of thing a lot, I travel. Huliaipole was astonishing. The local historical society there put so much care, put so much love and attention and funding into making sure that the history of their town, the history of their families, the history of their home could be told. And that if anyone went there, and many people did go there, they could figure things out on their own, not be lost, and be comfortable. If there is a historical building, there'd be a plaque that says, this is where so-and-so lived. This is where Makhno's brother lived. This is the factory that Makhno worked at. That kind of thing. It's easy to find your way around, which is very impressive. So I went to this factory, went to his family home. I went to the local history museum, which is originally a credit union that was actually owned by Jews at one point to encourage the settlement of Jews in the area. There's these experiments in agricultural settlement in the southern parts of Ukraine, but this credit union was a part of agricultural settlement of southern Ukraine. And going to this museum was one of my favorite museums of my entire life. I very much got the personal treatment. They came in, it's like, you're so glad to have you as a visitor. Let me tell you everything you could ever want to know about our city. They were so nice. They did not speak English, but my language comprehension was good enough to understand what they were saying. And I'm sad recounting this. And afterwards, they took the photos that they took of me and put them on their Facebook site as a yield from dream to action. Do you dream of waking up in another country one morning, jealous of your friends who have a dozen interesting places behind your shoulders, crying when you watch travel programs, but your travel bag still outside the apartment? It's time to make a difference. From today, travel for you should become not a dream, but a goal. In the photos, journalist Anthony from America is on a thematic excursion. And I certainly showed up pretty focused on two topics, which was obviously the story of Nestor Makhno, but also the Jewish history of the town. One of my side projects, Ukraine Jewish travels. I go to different parts of the country, go to a town, find an old synagogue, find out what happened to it, do a little write-up on my website, which is largely gone unused. So if you go to that website now, Ukraine Jewish Travel is written as though the full-scale invasion had not yet happened. Mariupol's on there. So I wanted to see the Jewish history of this place. Old synagogue is now attached to the local hospital. The local hospital itself originally built on Jewish funding, and I believe Nestor Makhno's wife taught at a school that was also funded by the Jewish community. The central square, a lot of the then standing shops were originally built as part of the Jewish market. And that was one of my favorite trips. Small, short, but very engaging, very meaningful. Lovely people. That museum was hit by a rocket about a year ago. Much of it caught fire. And just in December, it was hit again, and the building was completely destroyed. The hospital that the synagogue was attached to was destroyed. The historic mills that the city was associated with are destroyed. The home of Makhno's brother that had a statue in front of it was destroyed. Nearly everything that I saw that day is now destroyed. It has been on the front line since 2022, and ever since very, very early on, the city was nearly uninhabitable. Its access to utilities were knocked out in the spring of 2022. All this time, it had gone without pretty much anything. The population before the full-scale invasion was 13,000 people. By 2024, that was down to a little bit over 1,000, and by December, only 200 people remained. They very, very wisely fled, with only a small handful being able to remain, largely because they were old and firm and could not go anywhere, as is the case over and over again. I always told myself that I would go back, that I would be able to tell the story of that town while there is still time to tell it. Through a variety of factors, I have had difficulty returning to the field. I wish to correct that in 2026, certainly, but I had difficulties returning to the field. And Huliaipole itself was largely not inaccessible, but certainly a danger zone that one could not simply show up in like you could in Kharkiv or something like that. It had always been dangerous. The people I had known who had made stopovers in that city did not stay there. They would kind of touch and go, get in, film their stuff, get out. Too much artillery, too many drones, too many bombs to really do much more than that. But because of all that, I was not able to go back. I felt I owed it to Huliaipole. I felt I owed it to myself to do that. And this is certainly a tangent, but I feel like I have to say it. I have left many places in my life. I had moved between countries. I had done a lot of traveling. I'm very far away from where I grew up and have been for most of my adulthood. There are many places which are places that I used to be, not places where I am. And saying goodbye has always been a process. But to me, the final part of saying goodbye is going back. This place that you lived, you go back a few years later, it's still there, still going. You weren't that important to it. Life goes on without you. The spots that you used to frequent and are so attached to your memory, some of them are something different now. This restaurant you liked is now something else. Or the places you used to frequent are being frequented by someone else now. It's part of their story. And you're able to get your final closure. Honestly, even when I travel, I like to go back to places I had already been, see it through different eyes, sometimes years apart, see how things changed. And if there's a place I really love, when I leave, I say, I'll come back later. I don't need to do everything now. I can come back later to it. Maybe when I have a bit more time. Maybe for a holiday or something, where it would be a different experience. And there are so many places now I can't do that. I am not Ukrainian, but there are many places in Ukraine that I came to love that I could never go back to again. Mariupol, much of Kherson Oblast, Berdyansk, Avdiivka, Konstantinivka. Some of them are under occupation. Some of them were destroyed and now are under occupation. And some, even free, were destroyed. There's no going back there. There's nowhere to go back to. If Ukraine is able to push the Russians out of Huliaipole, there's no Huliaipole left. And this is just me talking as a tourist who liked visiting there once. The people who lived there, refer to how I began this episode, that's gone. Everything they knew is gone, destroyed. From the Huliaipole History Facebook group that is dedicated to telling the story of this town, they did a year in review of 2025. Quote, the main summary of the year is disappointing. Most of the territory of the Huliaipole community is occupied in 2025. Most of the city of Huliaipole is occupied to date. Fighting continues in the actually destroyed city. Defending the city and the settlements of the community killed many worthy defenders of Ukraine, killed many civilian local residents. From the time of the city's founding in the late 18th century, this is the biggest disaster it has experienced. A catastrophe after which the city, if ever it resurrects, will never be the same. Past cities and communities were created by its residents who are now scattered around the world. The youth who were supposed to create the future of the community, carrying deep local historical tradition and family memory, for the most part, they will hardly return to their origins. Most of the cultural, historical, economic, and social practices of the community that formed over the 240 years of history after this war will be abolished. If there is ever a new page in the history of the community, what it will be will depend on those who return or come again to these bloody lands of the Ukrainian steppe. What will be that new page of history, and whether it will be at all, will be shown by time and the armed forces of Ukraine. Let's remember the city as it was. It's gone. There's nothing there anymore. With that said, there are initiatives to try to keep the memory of what was alive. The organization After Silence, you can go to aftersilence.co, I'll put it in the description, took part in putting together an exhibition of the historical memory of the area. Many artifacts were evacuated from the museums and various historical projects in the city. Much of the collection that they had on display was from the Krieger family museum estate, a Lutheran capitalist family in the city, that was being turned into a museum and was completed only a week before the full-scale invasion. It's now destroyed. But before it was destroyed, they were able to evacuate many of the artifacts, and since then, they, and working alongside others from the community, were able to put together the stories of the displaced Huliaipole community. This exhibition took place in Lviv. I could not go, but I bought the book. It's from the start of this book. It's called Huliaipole, Temporarily Displaced Stories. It's now the 4th year that Huliaipole is just a few kilometers away from the front line. The city daily endures Russian attacks. Military personnel and civilians are dying. Buildings are being destroyed. Valuable records of the past disappear forever. Forced to flee their homes, people rarely have room in their emergency evacuation bags for family photos or documents, not to mention larger items. The scale of such losses is impossible to assess. And if it's impossible to measure the losses, can anything at all be saved? Since 2022, the Huliaipole Antiquities Initiative has been working to preserve the historical heritage of this frontline region, evacuating museum collections and family archives, preserving, restoring, and digitizing them, as well as researching the history of Huliaipole and the surrounding villages. Many stories need to be pieced together from the fragments of memory, just as shattered artifacts are reconstructed from broken pieces. In 2025, the exhibition Huliaipole Temporary Displaced Stories was exhibited in the public history space After Silence in Lviv. This exhibition presents a series of objects and stories from Huliaipole and the region, connected to the traumatic events of the 20th century. These items were temporarily displaced to storage and are now brought to this exhibition in Lviv. One day, we believe, they will eventually be returned to Huliaipole. And this book has the pictures, there's QR codes that lead to videos that the NGO put on. They recount that they had even were in the process of building some kind of memorialization for the Holocaust as it happened in Huliaipole. I'll leave the links again. Please view them. The preservation of these stories, the preservation of people's stories is so important, because what's being destroyed right now is not just physical places. Like I said, it is laden with memory and meaning that's just going away. And every effort to try to preserve that, it's a way of saying that it still exists, that Russia can't destroy everything, that Russia can't destroy identity, it can't destroy memory, it can't destroy who you are, as hard as they try. These family stories, these photographs, every one of them is resistance against Russian genocidal imperialism. But at the same time, regrets remain to see it one last time while it still could be seen. That is the close of this episode. I'm sure there's lots of lessons in there that you want to extract from. It's certainly something I agonize over. I'm not going to try to preach what specifically you're supposed to take. Everyone's approach will be slightly different. So yes, welcome to 2026. A new year to make new memories, a new year to face new tragedies, and hopefully a new year to win new victories. But to close out, as always, if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. Your support is what allows us to continue this project. We'll go over some of the ideas that we have in our future episodes. We have, of course, the year in review, as well as the questions and answers. Again, go to our Patreon, message us what you want to know. It does not have to be just about politics or war or anything like that. Last time we did a Q&A, we very much appreciated having the lighthearted questions as well. Though this is not the best episode to ask for anything lighthearted, but our supporters are what keep things going, and we want to engage with you of what you want to know. So to thank our current patrons, thank you very much to Randy and McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivana Kukratskaya, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, Kyle Stark, T. Bart, Barbara, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jane Louise, Marguerite, Kevin, Al Britton, Dimitri, Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Big Meg, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazan, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, Justin Devendorf, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Rochemel, Ada McDonald, George, Victor Matei, Scott Tokayuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Matt Miller, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Sandra Bongers, Marianne, RDK, Francois, Lori Halila, Justin R., Christopher Yee, Lemonikin, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Nashkus, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Kiwi Valley, Denna Jones, Joseph Erlone, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kunkel, and Matthew Rowe. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini!